Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, a 120-foot long, 12-foot tall, site-specific sculpture made of Corten steel, spanned the Foley Federal Plaza in Manhattan from 1981 to 1989. Now you may be able to guess the controversy surrounding this work just by looking at these images. For many people, the idea of bisecting an entire plaza with an insurmountable piece of steel is absurd. If you're not inhabiting the plaza in the mode of contemplating art, then the sculpture is merely an obstacle. It was an obstacle to the flow of pedestrians and to their field of vision. The issue that emerged, however, was barely addressed through a discussion of how artwork relates to its context. Rather, it became a debate between those who had total disdain for it and wanted it removed, and those who were prepared to defend the work as soldiers defending the mission of art regardless of personal taste. Now, as a site-specific work, it was meant to be permanent. To move it is to destroy it. And it was destroyed. After years of debate, it was finally removed in 1989. The plaza is not a pedestal. It is not a museum. It does not exist solely as a stage to contemplate art. Rather, it is a means for pedestrians to circulate through the city space, to enter and leave the Federal Plaza building. This is completely obvious, so how did any of this happen to begin with? In some ways, its existence as an obstruction answers the question of how this all happened, because Richard Serra is the sculptor known for taking sculpture off the pedestal. Serra brought an immediacy to sculpture. He brought it down to the level of the viewer. Serra's largest works inhabit our space. They take claim over our space, and in some ways they deny it to us. Here are a few more examples of Richard Serra's large-scale, site-specific work. This is called Contour. This is Spin Out. And this work is Clara Clara. And you can see that Serra's work very often integrates itself into a landscape experience. It takes over the landscape. The scale of these site-specific works break up the one-to-one relationship between an individual and a work of art. These works are too large to be grasped as a whole while in their presence. Obviously, if you're looking down at them, you can get an aerial sense of their totality. But if you share the same ground as these works, they overwhelm the body's relation to the smaller, more tangible objects of our surroundings. Not all of Serra's work is this large. The artist has experimented in many ways over his career. Among his various projects is his verb list. This gives us a great example of how Serra thinks about sculpture and the experience of it. Serra is quoted as saying that drawing is a verb. Now, each verb on the list corresponds or potentially corresponds to a sculpture. This could be seen as a sculptural to-do list. By considering a verb as a unit, we reduce an act to its most basic meaning. It cannot be reduced or broken down any further without becoming something else or something incomplete. And so each verb presents a fundamental objective to be achieved in reality, as an act, a singular act to be manifested through the physicality of sculpture. Here are some examples. This is titled To Lift, and we can see the direct correspondence. The materiality here serves no other end other than to illuminate the singular action, the verb, to lift. This is one example of his prop pieces, and there are several versions of these. These sculptures create their meaning in a single stroke, just like the verbs they correspond to. Bringing our consideration of the physical world around us to this abstract level allows us to engage with a city composed of many different aesthetic values. This is what I feel is most important about Serra's work, as well as minimalist and post-minimalist sculpture generally. A city like New York City, a modern city, is built with many different architectural styles, different philosophies about how something ought to look. Serra's verb list provides simple actions to be represented in the physical world. To lift, to pull, to prop. These objectives are basic, they are elemental, they are to be found in countless manifestations throughout the engineering of the city. They are fundamental and abstract the way a line is an abstract element of a drawing. In 1989, Serra was quoted in a New York Times article by Deborah Solomon as saying that in Europe you have a historical continuum of public sculpture that's gone on from Donatello to Rodin and continues today. In the United States, you have just the opposite. The government has excluded the possibility of any public sculpture that does not reinforce the official ideology of the state. When we consider the role of public art, any public work, any monument or sculpture, there is inherently an objective to provide some sense of membership in society. That society is something that we participate together in, and our mutual consideration of a work of art as an end in itself provides a sense of collective membership. It provides something that we could all adhere to. Serra complains that public art in the United States has to endorse its ideology, but I would say that this is true everywhere. It is very often explicitly true with Donatello and Rodin, who, as figurative sculptors, often use their work to commemorate people and historic events, thereby endorsing the ideology and culture of their society. In cases where public work is abstract or minimalist, there is still an implicit endorsement of collective identity, in that by recognizing a work of art as a work of art requires those who encounter it to see it as an end in itself. It has to stand out against the ground of its environment, and in order to do that, it has to be mutually recognized as a work of art. It has to have its own authority to be considered this way. Now, New York City, unlike the pre-modern cities of Europe, is set up to be practical. The numbered streets, its gridded layout, all serve the end of being easy to navigate. It is easy to figure out where you are just by looking at the nearest street corner. Now, when we look at a city like New York from a distance, what we see appears like a magnet that has attracted thousands of jagged pieces of metal up from the floor. It appears like a bed of nails, to borrow an analogy from Luc Sant. It has no grand order, it has no convention. It is a grab bag of architectural and aesthetic values and philosophies. And if we ask what is compatible with all of this variety, what fits into all of these conflicting aesthetic ideas, it would have to be something as fundamental and as abstract as Serra's verb list and the works which correspond with it. This is one reason why Serra has been such a successful artist. The city is built with verbs, built with physical action, the likes of which we see on Serra's list. The city is full of different examples of things to be propped up, things to be suspended, to be rolled, to be lifted. Serra's verb list is abstracted to the generality of a single word without context, and so it could be found in any example of architecture. It could be found in countless features throughout the city. Serra's work as a whole appears to have taken the physical language of the city and abstracted it. His work removes the utilitarian element to illuminate an abstract sense of mass, an abstract sense of brute physicality, totally indifferent to human affairs and practical use. Serra abstracts aesthetic qualities from what we normally bypass when we consider the functional purpose of things. By exercising our appreciation, our consideration of sculpture, we equip ourselves to see the city in a new light. This is what is so great about contemporary art. It equips us to aesthetically see what is not meant to be seen aesthetically. It allows us to appreciate an environment that is not designed to be visually appreciated. It allows us to find our place in an environment that estranges us. This is the most important role of contemporary art in my view. The disunity of the city seen at a distance estranges us. It alienates us. It appears like an endless competition of conflicting projects. But when in the midst of it, in the heart of it, we find ourselves as being one with it, we flow with it, we are it. For Serra, the fact that Tilted Arc was removed, destroyed, is an ideological issue. That since it was commissioned by the government, it was the property of the government, and so the property rights that allowed the government to remove the sculpture was a symptom of its ideology. Serra certainly has a point here, but I don't think the destruction of Tilted Arc had much to do with the ideological importance of property rights. That's certainly part of it, but I think it mostly fell out of favor by consumers' demand for something new and an impatience with anything that interrupts a fast-paced environment. New York City has a history of erasing its treasures. It is not a city of monuments. There are no sacred heroes to pay tribute to in New York City. You have to go to Washington, D.C. for that kind of thing. When we compare Tilted Arc with a few of Serra's other large on-site installations, we could see an important difference. In regards to Clara Clara or to Contour, we have, in each of these cases, a presentation that allows us to accept the work as an end in itself, and we have no other reason to be in its midst. We encounter these works in order to experience them, and we do so without any other objective. Serra was outraged by the destruction of Tilted Arc, and I think his politics is a distraction not worth getting too deep into. Serra became fixed on the issue of whether the owner of his artwork has the authority to destroy it. The artwork is by the artist Richard Serra, but the commodity belongs to the federal government, and the government is oppressing Serra's freedom of speech. The government commissioned the work. A representative government has its obligation to democratic values, and that is where the pressure to remove Tilted Arc came from, not property rights. Serra was very adamant about the site specificity of Tilted Arc. It could go nowhere else. But why is that? There are many large-scale Serra works owned by private collectors who exhibit them in their backyards. In these cases, such works are not contingent to the specific site in which they exist. So for Richard Serra to insist that Tilted Arc could only exist in the Federal Plaza means that the Federal Plaza is integral to the work. If so, then it should be in harmony with the plaza, in which case he would have to admit to the failure of Tilted Arc. Moreover, if the plaza is integral to the work, does he extend his claim of artistic authorship over the plaza itself? This is obviously untenable. If we refine ourselves to appreciate minimalist art, then we can look at anything in the city as an end in itself, as a work of art, regardless of whether it was meant to be seen as such. What matters in these cases is the intention of the viewer to see any given object as an end in itself. Tilted Arc discouraged those who encountered it to consider it as art. It was seen as an obstruction, an obstacle to the practicality of New York City. As I mentioned earlier, contemporary art, at its best, conditions us to appreciate all of the visual phenomena that is not meant to be seen as art. Contemporary art gives us a vocabulary to inhabit a world that estranges us and to make it our own. Serra describes his childhood looking at massive ships being built on the West Coast, the way he was awed at their scale. He recalls seeing a ship being launched at a shipyard and how its prodigious mass glided into the water and became buoyant. This appreciation is an appreciation of the raw condition of his environment, and this is what he shares with us through his work. Tilted Arc was put up in a place where it could not be seen as a work of art. It could not be seen as an end in itself. This is because the plaza it was placed in is a means to another end. It is a means of entering and exiting a building. It is a mediation between interior and exterior spaces. And so Tilted Arc was destined to fail, because it did not allow the plaza to be a plaza. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Also find me on Instagram at @RobSamartino.